While our last chapter was focused on where should we put the CSS, if it's going to be directly on the thing you want to style, if it's going to be in the header of the file, if it's going to be in an external file. Now we turn our attention to the actual CSS, and even before we start manipulating properties, we want to get familiar with the three most common ways to define a selector. Now, a selector is basically when you select something that you want to manipulate. We've seen one of them. But in this lecture, we're going to take a look at it one more time, where how do you select something inside of an HTML to be able to define it? And throughout the next three lectures, we're going to meet the three most common selectors, starting with just writing down the name of the thing that you want to select, such as an H1 or a div or a paragraph. So let's see it in action. So far, all of our CSS rules were really flat. We talked directly to specific items. If it was our body, if it was the A tag, if it was one of our headlines, H1, 2, and 3. But I want to take a step deeper into CSS and see that CSS is really a language that is about structure. So really, in our case, we could define rules that are based on specificalities on the location of an element. For example, if I had here another H1, and I'm just going to go ahead here and create it. Just for the sake of this presentation, this will be our first H1. I'll go ahead here and save it, go back into my application and click on refresh. We'll see that we'll have here our first headline followed by our internal headline. Now, what if I wanted to have a different rule and a different size, for example, for my first headline versus my internal headline, even though they have the exact same name? Now, the difference between them is that this first headline is sitting in this global H1 position. Our body, right into it, it's our H1. Contrary to that, our H1 that is inside is sitting inside of a div, and it's inside of there. What I could do is go ahead and set here another H1. So I'm going to go ahead here and just define a global H1 that, let's say this one will be 60 pixels, but go ahead and define an internal one saying, hey, if you're a div, inside of a div, inside of that an H1, then define that to 45. So only if all these rules apply, then define your font size to be 45. If I go ahead and click on refresh, you'll see that now we'll have your one H1 that is much larger and one that is smaller. And that's really about traveling inside of your CSS. So instead of having only flat CSS, I could have rules that help me filter out content. Now, I didn't have to put the full path. If I wanted to, I could have said only just one div, and because our H1 inside of our element, any H1 that is inside of a div would adhere to this rule. And if I go ahead and click on refresh, we'll see that even though I change that rule, I'm still in a larger position for my first element that makes it stand out compared to my second element. Now notice if I go inside and I inspect this element, that we're getting that 60 inside of it in our element. And if I go inside of this element, we'll see for our H1 that internal law that says that specific specification, and notice how it's overriding the global rule of our H1. Now, you might ask yourself, what would happen if you put this H1 above our H1 that is underneath it? Now, in this case, what's happening is you have this first rule that is defined for internal H1s, followed by a global rule for H1s in general that are setting it to 60 pixels. If I click here on refresh, notice that what is the size of my global element now? It's still 60. Notice the size of my internal element, it's still 45. With that said, if I had the same exact rule, although I like setting it in this way because it shows us that this is really going to override that above item, but it's not necessarily automatic. If I have another H1 rule by mistake that I forgot somewhere, and I set that internal rule for the example to 20 pixels, then yes, the last item that has been called is going to be the rule that is going to be applied. And literally we're going to have two items being overridden. So really the rules in CSS are defined by what is the closest rule to our item, and then followed by what is the last item. So it's not automatically the last item, it's the last item in the most closest rule to our specific element. Alright? So that covers this topic.